Hello and welcome to Antibiotics in Agriculture, Preventing the Next Pandemic. My name is Chris Green and I'm the Executive Director of the Harvard Animal Law and Policy Program. This is the third such biennial event we've hosted in partnership with US PIRG as part of Antibiotic Awareness Week. I quickly just like to thank our other co-sponsors, which include the Harvard Animal Law Society, the HLS Food Law Lab, HLS Food Law and Policy Clinic, Green Century, and the Petrie-Flom Center for Health Law, Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics at Harvard Law School. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to this evening's moderator, Nicole Negowetti, who's the clinical instructor at our Animal Law and Policy Clinic.
Hi, good afternoon or good evening, everyone, and thanks, Chris. I'm looking forward to a fascinating discussion with an outstanding panel of experts that are joining us this evening, each of whom brings a very unique perspective on the pressing issue of antibiotic resistance. And before I turn it over to each of them to introduce themselves and give their opening remarks, I'll briefly share our goals for tonight's discussion. So in their introductions and during the discussions, the panelists will provide context to understand the issue of antibiotic resistance as a pandemic, provide suggestions and examples of how antibiotic stewardship can be improved in different industries, and make suggestions for corporate and for policy reforms. We are very much looking forward to engaging all of you in the conversations. So please type in all of your questions into the Q&A and we will address them at the end. And with that, I will turn it over to our esteemed panelists to give their introductions and share their unique perspective on these issues. So Andrew, would you please start?
Hello, everybody. Thanks for tuning into this webinar. Thanks for having me on it. I'm a reporter for the New York Times. I'm a health reporter, and I've focused a bit in the last few years on the problem of antibiotic resistance. And part of that means focusing on the use of antibiotics in agriculture, which is a huge problem, not just in the United States, but all over the world. In the United States, the problems are pretty unique in certain developed countries, that is, because the United States has a lot of impediments in terms of regulating and just the information that we can get on antibiotic use in agriculture. You know, part of the challenge here in the U.S. is that there's not really good data on specific use on farms, although the federal government does collect statistics on antibiotic use, sort of large-scale stats. There's no sort of spot checks and spot sort of data on farms. The other problem is sort of the agriculture industry is very powerful here, and they sort of prevent a lot of sort of measures that would help us kind of curtail this problem. Another factor is sort of there's these things called ag-gag laws, which can penalize people, journalists, activists who disclose details or take video on farms. So these are some of the challenges that are faced here in the U.S. You know, broadly speaking, I think what would, besides sort of improving these kind of oversight, would just be sort of providing more sort of better conditions on factory farms for the animals, which would help reduce antibiotic use. You know, crowded, when you have animals, you know, pigs and cows and chickens living very closely together, that sort of, you know, makes it more likely they're going to need antibiotics. So these are sort of very kind of contentious things that that would help ameliorate the situation, but the agriculture industry is generally opposed to that. And I think we'll hear more about that tonight. But I think maybe the biggest kind of impetus for change would be consumers, and consumers demanding meat that is free of antibiotics is actually a very strong kind of motivating factor for companies. McDonald's and a lot of other fast food chains have committed to reducing or eliminating the meat they use, they sell that has antibiotics. So it's not all dismal out there. There are ways to sort of help push this issue forward. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Andrew. Chris, would you please introduce yourself?
Sure, Nicole. Thanks for having me. I'm Chris Oliviero. I am the general manager for Niman Ranch. I've been with Purdue for about 14 years. And if you don't know, Purdue acquired Niman Ranch about 5 years ago. And for those of you who are not familiar with Niman Ranch, Niman Ranch has been a leader in the protein industry in the areas of animal care, support for independent family farms, and sustainable farming. And I view success for our brand in making the rest of the industry a little bit uncomfortable. Niman's entire portfolio of we're a pork, lamb, and beef supplier, and the entire portfolio has been no antibiotics ever since the beginning. So we've never had to go through the process of converting and removing antibiotics from the system. Now I want to contrast that with Purdue. Purdue is a premium brand of poultry sold nationally. And in 2006, I had the chance to help Purdue launch their first brand of NAE poultry, a brand called Harvestland. It's now a $300+ million brand. It's extended into organic, but it's a very different process, when you have to go through, having a system that has, used antibiotics to a point and have to remove them, from having had the benefit of never using them in the first place. So I think tonight, what's really important, and Andrew, I really, just want to echo your comments. It's hard. There's a lot that can be done, but it takes effort. And food companies have the responsibility. It's our job to show what's possible, not just to consumers, but also to our customers, and also to farmers. We have to help them understand why it's so important and why removing antibiotics for those who are using them can be done without impacting their business. It's our job, also to create the market and show farmers and consumers alike why it matters. So looking forward to tonight. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much, Chris. Sorry, I was stuck on mute there. Dr. Patel, would you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Payal Patel. I'm an infectious diseases physician and I specialize in antimicrobial stewardship. And it's really important to see the different perspectives here today, because why is everything that we're talking about so important? Any of us could be in the hospital with any kind of infection, just from a dog bite or, scratching your elbow on your porch going outside. And more often we're seeing infections that don't have any antibiotics left to treat. And that's not a rare thing that we see in the hospital these days. And we're trying to kind of hope that we can make some steps forward through what we're doing on this panel to make that less and less common. And so, all of this is interconnected. What we do in the hospital is we try to make sure that the antibiotics that we're using are really used in a way to save what we can, but there's so much more that could be done from the agriculture standpoint. And so we're so excited as the medical community to be a part of this conversation. I'm just excited to hear from everyone and talk to all of you today.
Thank you so much for sharing that perspective. Sydney, I will turn it over to you.
Hi all. Like everyone else on this panel, I'm thrilled to be here and really excited that we were able to bring this together with Harvard Law School for yet another year. My name is Sydney Riess. I work as the Public Health Campaigns Associate here at USPIRG, and I'm taking the lead on our campaign to stop the overuse of antibiotics. We work particularly in livestock and agriculture, and USPIRG has had a really long history of working with this issue. We campaign both with companies and federal governments to take action. And we campaign on the premise of eliminating all medically important antibiotics from routine use in animal agriculture. There's two really important definitions here and some that often get muddled. So medically important antibiotics, it refers to all antibiotics that are in classes considered important to human medicine. And this is based off of a list that the World Health Organization curates for us. And we know that these antibiotics are critical for human health. And routine usage refers to antibiotics that are used on a routine basis to prevent disease in otherwise healthy animals. these are probably terms we'll be talking about a lot throughout the conversation, and terms that don't necessarily have strict definitions. So I wanted to clarify them coming out the bat on where exactly we're falling and what we're calling for here. But yeah, to comment on what other folks have said, we have known about the issue of antibiotic resistance since the 1970s, and there has been not enough movement, especially in federal legislation. But we're really proud and happy to have worked with fast food companies and meat producers that have moved this issue forward, especially in the chicken industry. But we do know that looking at the data that there's still a long way to go, especially in beef and pork. So I'm thrilled to be here along with everyone to help come up with some solutions for pushing this issue forward.
Thank you so much, Sydney. That was really helpful. And Kezia, would you please introduce yourself?
Thanks. Hello, everybody. And like everyone else has said, it's really great to be here. My name is Kezia Smithe, and I'm an ESG analyst at the FAIRR initiative. So I'm bringing a bit of a different perspective, the investor perspective. The FAIRR initiative is a non-profit. We're part of the Jeremy Collar Foundation, and we're a network of institutional investors, so pension funds, asset owners, and asset managers. And we conduct research and engagements with companies on environmental and social issues, including climate change, biodiversity loss and deforestation, workers' rights, but also, of course, antimicrobial resistance and responsible antibiotics use. And AMR is a core issue for us, and it's increasingly top of the agenda for investors as well. They're looking at companies that they're invested in, and they're increasingly asking questions like, how is this company involved in stewardship and responsible usage, or how is this company actually contributing to the misuse or overuse of antibiotics and growing resistance? And given the huge health and economic impacts of antimicrobial resistance that are happening today, and like Payal mentioned, increasingly problems in hospitals, increasingly going to have huge economic impacts, I think investors are increasingly noticing these externalities, pricing them in, thinking about the long-term risks to their portfolios that's posed by this health crisis. So investors are recognizing the risks. They're also recognizing their role and their ability to actually be really forceful stewards of antibiotics alongside civil society organizations, and how they can encourage companies throughout the food supply chain, in particular, to reduce antibiotic use and become responsible actors. It's great that investors have this special position as shareholders in companies where they can really shape company strategy, persuade company management teams to address issues that are important to them as investors, but important to the long-term business performance and competitive performance of companies, and of course, most importantly, important for healthy functioning societies. So I'm here today to bring this investor perspective. I'm really looking forward to bringing that into the discussion and answering any questions about how investors can act, what investors are doing, and how investors are thinking about this issue.
Thank you very much to all of you for setting the stage for our discussion. So let's start with the questions. I have lots of them to ask of you, and I'm sure that our audience members do as well. So let's start, Dr. Patel, I have a question for you. So we have entitled this event, Preventing the Next Pandemic. Would you please explain how COVID has presented an opportunity or additional challenges in dealing with the issue of antibiotic resistance?
Yeah, I mean, I think that COVID has really highlighted some of the existing issues that we kind of have in public health and in medicine. And specifically, as we talk about antibiotics, one thing that we've noticed is early on when we were getting lots of people coming to the hospital, we know that COVID is a viral pneumonia. And one of the times that antibiotics are often overused is antibiotics don't work against viruses. But, you know, when someone is very sick, it can be hard to, you know, not give them something that you think might make them better. So we noticed that even though we knew antibiotics don't work against COVID, there was a very high use of antibiotics early on when we started seeing a lot of patients. So what different antibiotic stewardship programs in the US as well as worldwide have been focusing on is trying to really make sure that we don't forget about antibiotic resistance while we're in the midst of this other pandemic, because truly antibiotic resistance on its own is a crisis. It's just a little bit slower than the COVID pandemic that we're in. And so one thing that we're really worried about in the antibiotic stewardship community is that when COVID is said and done, that we have really used way too many antibiotics internationally, and that we may see a rise in antimicrobial resistance across the board.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to weigh in on that question?
Yeah, I think to continue with the conversation of pandemic preparedness, I'm hoping to see, and I think we've heard murmurs of it, that when we go forward with federal and state legislation to help fill in some of the gaps that we've seen in our public health infrastructure from COVID-19, that antibiotic resistance and antimicrobial resistance are up there at the top of the list when it comes to pandemic preparedness. Like Payal said, these are one and the same. It's a slower pandemic, but it is nonetheless. And making real steps with federal legislation can help us from preventing the, I guess, death of antibiotics as they exist today.
Thanks, Sydney and Dr. Patel. So let's turn our attention now to the agricultural industry. And Chris, I have a question for you. So we've heard about significant changes that have happened over the past few years in the chicken supply chains, but there's been less progress in the beef, pork, and turkey industries. So what do you think, from your perspective, are the lessons that can be learned from Niman Ranch's long-held commitment to no antibiotics, and then the transition that Purdue has made to meat that's raised without antibiotics?
Sure. Great question. I think it all starts with transparency. To build a business that's focused on, and a brand that's focused on the removal of antibiotics, you have to assure farmers, consumers, customers, everybody on the authenticity of the program. And there's skepticism out there. With large companies, small companies, greenwashing is a real thing. So in Niman's case, long before me, they published the protocols that they have in terms of animal care practices, not just the removal of antibiotics, but other things that are really important as well. The elimination of gestation and farrowing crates and those sorts of things. But I want to spend a few minutes or moments focusing on the challenges of converting over. I had the unique opportunity at Purdue to kind of witness and participate in that process of converting. And the most important point is, it is not as simple as simply removing antibiotics from the feed. If you do that, you'll replace an antibiotic crisis with an animal welfare crisis. You need to also at the same time remove the sources of stress. Andrew touched on this at the beginning, that drive the uses or the need for antibiotics in the first place. Things like raising animals outdoors where that's practical, that helps. Managing density is critically important. If you can allow them to exhibit natural behavior. Think about people. I think when we can do the things that matter, we can see it in our own personal health. It's no different with animals. For reference, Purdue spent more than 10 years preparing to remove antibiotics entirely from the system. And they were the first first major brand to remove 100% of antibiotics from their system. I think kind of last point I want to make on this is it's really important that when you do this, you don't create an incentive for farmers not to treat sick animals. That's a big risk. And for us at Niman Ranch, it's one of the reasons that our team of field agents who work with our farmers and ranchers is larger than the number of people we have working in sales. It's just really important throughout all this that we don't create that incentive, that we have open lines of communication with farmers. We can't do this without them. We need that feedback loop so that we can hear from them to address concerns, answer questions, and ultimately they can provide the feedback on what's working and what's not to make the program better and more sustainable in the future.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah.
Does anyone want to add to that? So the issue of transparency was mentioned by Chris at the beginning of his answer, and Andrew, you have mentioned this as well in your opening remarks. I wonder if you could talk a bit more about the challenges that you encountered in reporting on this issue, given the lack of transparency, and how you were able to overcome those issues to do the in-depth reporting that you did?
Well, one way to overcome it, which is not one I recommend for most people, is I accompanied a group of animal rights activists who would basically break into farms at night to sort of to gain sort of intelligence, and that's one way I did that. But otherwise, it's about talking to researchers, talking to former government officials who are willing to discuss what they know. The problem is that a lot of farmers are distrustful of this kind of oversight. They feel like it'll unfairly malign them and hurt their business. So researchers are challenged by that too, because they can't just show up at a farm and do spot checks, and it's very, very hard to kind of get that information. I like to kind of compare to experience in Denmark. I did some reporting last year in Denmark, which has a very huge pork industry, and they have the complete buy-in and cooperation with farmers, because they're sort of there's a lot of trust there. And I think that's a big problem in this country, is the lack of trust. And in Denmark, the government and farmers and activists are all sort of on the same page, and they are happy to have researchers come in and journalists and see what they're doing. And I think that can go a long way in advancing this issue.
Does anyone else have a response to that question or want to add to what Andrew said?
I'd just like to,
Chris?
I just want to say, Andrew, if you ever want to see one of our farms, let me know. You don't
I'm
need to break in the middle of night. We'll let you in. So just
I'm there.
All right, good deal.
Awesome. And Kezia, I think you had something to add as well.
Yes, I just wanted to echo what Andrew said. It's not just in Denmark. We also see in the UK, in our context here, there's been a lot of voluntary reduction initiatives, and that's really been driven by the fact that farmers are working together and moving away from this idea of distrust to actually it becoming a badge of pride, and showing that they are reducing antibiotics is really like high on the agenda, and something that the whole industry is bought into. And I think fostering that kind of conversation and having farmers speaking to farmers and leading by example and showing how it's possible really moves away from maybe the sort of more adversarial perspective that might be seen between civil society pressure or investor pressure and farmers feeling defensive. And so that farmers leading by example and that collaboration and communication is so vital.
Great, thank you for sharing that perspective. That was very valuable. And so Kezia, I have a question for you to follow up on that, and to follow up on your information that you shared about the increased investor support, which is very, very encouraging for antibiotic stewardship in the livestock supply chains. So how do you anticipate this support that's coming from the investors influencing the food companies who have yet to reduce antibiotics in their supply chain?
Yes, I think it really adds to this picture of increasing pressure and increasing awareness. And I'd like to use the example of an engagement that FAIRR ran relatively recently. We concluded in 2019 in terms of showing the growing investor support and also the changes that investors can help to bring about. So in 2019, since 2016 through to 2019, FAIRR engaged 20 fast food and casual dining companies, including McDonald's, Wendy's, Darden, Texas Roadhouse. And by the end of the engagement in 2018, we had 74 investors supporting the engagement, representing $4.9 trillion of assets under management. So it's a huge sum of investors recognizing that it's an issue they want to tackle, and they want to engage companies in a dialogue to improve their antibiotic policies, their disclosure of their policies, and their responsible use, reducing in antibiotic usage. And I think it's important to highlight that between 2016 and 2019, when we ran the engagement, we had a growth in both the number of investors supporting and also the size of the investors, representing more mainstream interest. We started off with 54 investors, we ended up with 74, so we grew from $1 trillion assets under management to, as I said, 4.9 trillion. And it shows that it's not just these smaller, what we would say more traditional responsible investment asset managers that are paying attention now. It's these mainstream large investors that are recognizing it as a critical issue that they need to manage. So the message to companies, I would say, is that it's increasingly on the radar of investors. They can expect investors to be asking questions, to be raising these questions, to be adding shareholder resolutions where possible to question them on their strategy. And if they're not seeing change, in the end, I think it feeds through into thinking about companies in comparison with their peers, why they're not making these changes. Do they become a less attractive investment? Are they thinking about these risks in the long term? And that applies not just to food companies, but to animal pharmaceutical companies that are selling these drugs, all the way through the food supply chain, really.
Thank you. Does anyone want to respond to that? Okay, so let's chat about policy. And Sydney, I'll turn this question over to you. What do you see as the policy opportunities at the federal level to address the issue of antibiotic resistance?
Yeah. Well, we know we need some is the broad answer to that. It starts in a multitude of ways. We need policy at the basic level on transparency. And while engaging companies like some of our larger fast food companies that we work with and with our coalition partners, we've been hearing from folks that this transparency and support from the government would actually help them in their initiatives moving forward with reducing the amount of medically important antibiotics, especially in their beef and in poultry or pork supply chains, in ways that they haven't been able to do quite as easily as chicken. So transparency is a huge bonus when it comes from the federal government. We also need to see, well, we can see that Congress has the opportunity to make a step in the right direction right now. They have an upcoming appropriations bill, and there has been language about duration limits placed on medically important antibiotics in agriculture in the House version. And we're hoping that through negotiations, this language will also be included in the final Senate version as well. To put a little bit of context to this, right now, 1/3 of medically important antibiotics have no established duration limits. And we know from public health experts that the longer antibiotics are used with animals, the higher the chance is of antibiotic resistant bugs spreading. It basically clears out all of the good bacteria and all of the bacteria that does respond to these antibiotics, and just leaves those bacteria that have formed resistance left in the animals, and they have the opportunity to spread and proliferate. So less is better, and having duration limits imposed on medically important antibiotics is going to be a huge step forward. So we are hoping to see that change coming up as soon as the end of this year with the appropriations bill. But I'd also like to open it up to some of the other panelists. I think the conversation around clear lines of communication between the government and farmers is so important because, Chris, you're completely right. Farmers know what needs to be done and how they need to be supported on the premises in order to move forward and reduce these antibiotic overusage. So I guess I'd like to open it up and ask a question of my own, but how can policy help support some of the farmers we're working with?
I'll just, I know Chris is going to say something really useful and I just stopped him, but I'll just say that this is one topic that policy is really important. I'll give you one example from kind of antibiotics in use in humans. In the last few years, very few years, antibiotic stewardship programs have become mandatory in all hospitals and nursing homes in the US, which is crazy, right? Because 15 years ago, there were very few programs, and we've gone from almost 0 to 100. And just with that time, you've seen antibiotic use actually drop in America. One of the best examples is in the VA, where the entire system has actually seen improvement in the use of antibiotics. So with policy in this space, antibiotic resistance, you really can see good benefits. So I think that this focusing on this for ag would be huge and have a big impact.
I think that's a great point. I'd want to build on that a little bit too, which is, I think not all of the policy answers have to tie directly to, to antibiotic usage itself. You can implement policy that goes after some of the conditions that require an elevated use of antibiotics. So, a good example of some progressive policy that's out there is Prop 12 out in California, restricting the use of gestation crates. Answer 3 in Massachusetts is similar. But I think the more policy that we can put in place that thinks about animal welfare considerations, I think that will have a secondary benefit of creating an environment where it's easier to remove antibiotics in the first place. And, so I think, working in tandem can be really effective.
So given that the problems of antibiotic resistance are so well known, and Sydney, as you mentioned earlier, we've known about this problem since the 1970s, and hearing from all of you about the important role that policy can play, what has been the holdup thus far? Why haven't we been able to get policy change on the issue, and how can we get past those barriers? It's a question that's open to all of you.
I mean, I'll jump in. I
Sure.
think if you go back, 10 years ago, there was a lot of uncertainty in terms of what would happen if you removed antibiotics, and with some of the larger companies that that had systems that were designed around it, there was that fear. And then, secondly, this question of, consumers and their understanding of it, and their willingness to, to vote with their wallets. I mean, it's taken a long time, I think, to get the kind of traction and momentum that we're seeing today. I look at the poultry industry, I think, the increase in purchases of no antibiotics chicken is up 50% between 2017 and 2019. So massive increase. There, and other proteins that have lagged, but I think as an industry, they kind of demystified it, and once you start to have one major player make that change, others have to follow, because you create that environment and that demand that's ultimately so important.
Yeah, I'll jump on that as well. Consumer understanding of the issue is massive, and it's not always easy for consumers to vote with their wallet, as you said, Chris. There are a lot of confusing or misleading labels out there on products that aren't clear about how exactly these animals were raised. So as we continue to educate consumers, it's important that we promote the labels that are in fact reducing the use of medically important antibiotics in all of our meats, and continuing to educate ourselves on which brands have the practices that we as consumers support. And that's a fight that's ongoing and something that's purely educational. But I do hope, as this conversation keeps happening and as labels keep cropping up on meats at the supermarket, people look down and say, maybe I should learn a little bit more about what antibiotics is and whether or not I want it as a part of the meat processing chain that I'm supporting with my dollar. But it is a big curve to educate on the issue that's really confusing and nuanced, and then also getting to a point where we have clear and consistent labeling on all of our packaging so people can make an informed decision.
Yeah, thank you for raising that issue of labeling. Actually, we have a question from the audience that's directly on point. So let me ask that now so we can continue that conversation. So from the audience, the question is, it's my understanding that only the organic label gives consumers the guarantee that an animal has not been given antibiotics. What other labels can the consumer trust with third-party inspection, ensuring animals are not given antibiotics?
I mean, I'll jump into it from a meatpacking perspective. I mean, if you see the statement "no antibiotics ever" on a package, that that statement is meaningful, and you can be verified. It should be trusted. There are other claims that are out there that are a little bit murkier, and I would tell you that one, if you went back a decade, there were some loopholes that could be used that have been closed, especially on the poultry side. But overall, I think that claim is valid, and it's one of many elements of organic.
I think there are some other certifications that are emerging. I know that NRDC have developed the Certified Responsible Antibiotic Usage Standards. And that's not a no antibiotics ever policy, but that's about just reducing use and only using where absolutely medically necessary. And so I think that is certified by the USDA or a third party. So there are these other certifications that are emerging that can be trusted because they have third party audit as well.
And there's a second part to that question, and this goes to you, Chris. How does NIMAN guarantee the consumer that antibiotics are not used?
Yeah, it's part of the auditing process that we do with our field agent teams. I mean, we have a large team, and they are out on farms. There's also extensive documentation from the farmers and ranchers that's required in terms of the feed that they're using. I mean, it's true we can't be there 100% of the time, but with our network of farmers and ranchers, there's a lot of communication that each farmer is responsible for the well-being of each of the other farmers, right? Because if one person, tries to game the system and do something that's not above board, they put the entire system at risk. And that's a regular topic for us. We get together with our farmers and ranchers twice a year, and that opportunity for sharing of ideas, discussion, what's working, and reinforcing that point is really important.
So we've covered different corporate and public policy solutions, the importance of public opinion, and of course the influence that the investors are having in this space as well. Are there other solutions that we haven't yet discussed that are important to consider?
Well, I do think we've touched on it a little bit. I think the influence or the role that industry plays in recognizing the issue and how we've really, it kind of comes back to the question about why we've not seen more progress in such a long time and knowing about it. But I think the evolving global consensus and action from the World Health Organization, the UN, really driving this One Health approach is really critical. But I think at the same time as the One Health approach becoming really all these industries recognizing the role they have to play, we do have to look at the way that industry behind the scenes may be supporting or not supporting policies that are positive to help change and things like that. So maybe that's a lens to look at as well, the lobbying aspect as well as the policy that needs to be developed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, does anyone else want to add to that?
I would just say that this is one of the topics in medicine, and we've seen this with COVID, we saw it with Ebola. It's very, I think a lot of times we think, this is our country, we're going to do it our way, and the other country will do it that way. But antimicrobial resistance, like it or not, is an international problem. And so for example, we'll often see someone who maybe just went on vacation somewhere else and picked up antibiotic resistant bug, or they just happen to get it here. It can fly with you back to your home, and it can be from your own home. And so the key here is really every country has to step up. And that's, I think, been part of it. Like in terms of antibiotic stewardship in the hospital, we've seen a lot of countries commit to it from the government standpoint with a voice, but not necessarily sometimes backed by money for the hospitals to truly give time to physicians or pharmacists to focus on this. And so in that way, it's one of the few medical problems that the WHO has really decided to kind of go after, because it's truly an international problem and not just a national problem.
Yes, thank you for raising that point. That's excellent. We haven't yet chatted about that. And so similarly, as we think about the pandemic preparedness, as was mentioned earlier, the same issue arises. It's not just an issue that each country is facing on its own. So in thinking about public health and pandemic preparedness, how should lawmakers be considering antibiotic resistance?
Yeah, I mean, I would say one thing that my research and my work has really focused on is that it looks like if you put your money where your mouth is in terms of hospitals and health systems, and you don't just say antibiotic resistance is important, but you actually make someone's job focusing on antibiotic resistance. That has been the key to improving antibiotic use in the hospitals. So if you were to take that lens to agriculture and actually, and someone has a question about administration and things like that, but putting your money where your mouth is in terms of antibiotic use in ag, rather than just hoping everyone will pitch in out of the goodness of their hearts, I think that would be the example that I would say has really worked in medicine.
Yes, does anyone want to add to that?
I mean, I think just to state the obvious, the role of federal government, of the role of Washington and all this, is super important in the messaging and having, some authoritative voices on that. And obviously we haven't had that much in the last few years here, but, just pointing out that the FDA, that they 2 years ago or in 2017, they banned the use of antibiotics in growth promotion, and that caused a huge drop, a 33% drop in antibiotic use. So, policy making is hugely important, and that a lot of that kind of stems from, leadership in this country.
Thank you. And so we're getting lots of great questions from the audience. So I'll start going through some of those. So let's start with this question. Do veterinarians have to report prescribed antibiotics to a central location, such as the USDA or the FDA?
Go ahead.
I was going to say that I don't think that is the case, but also it would be a huge burden if that was the case at the moment. And I think in terms of regulation, I'm not sure that even at the moment, all antibiotics may not have to have veterinary oversight in some cases. And so in that case, where there's not a prescription even, that's almost the first hurdle, actually introducing the importance of a prescription, so that every time an antibiotic is used on the farm, even they're recording why animals have been given a medicine. If we don't even have that in place, the idea of collecting these prescriptions in some central database is a few steps away, I'd say.
Yeah, as far as I know, the only figure we have is for sales. The only is veterinarian sales of antibiotics. So, which is somewhat useful. But I think if we were able to know more precisely how they're being used on farms and how much and for what, to treat what kind of illness, would be super helpful.
And I think it's really important that we brought up vets, actually, because the role of the vet is also critical in terms of the relationship with the farmer and ensuring that's where the advice is coming from for using antibiotics, and that the use of antibiotics where it does happen isn't through the feed companies, for instance, for growth promotion purposes. And so it's really great to have mentioned that, and the importance of moving towards definitely at least having prescriptions.
So our next question is, what happens to the animals who have infections or otherwise need antibiotics for treatment if you have a no antibiotics ever policy? And Chris, you sort of touched on this, so you want to take this question?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, they're removed from, from the program. So in the case of, Niman Ranch with our farmers, for example, if they have a sick animal, we absolutely encourage and require that they treat them. And then, there's different options in terms of, harvesting them for a commodity program or just for, for their own local needs, but they cannot go into the Niman Ranch program. If they do treat an animal, they have to segregate it off to the side. For Purdue, it's a similar approach. They have, it can't go into any of the Purdue or any other branded programs that are required to be no antibiotics ever. But if they do have to treat animals, that they can go into a commodity sale. And it just comes in, what's important is how you sequence bringing those animals into the plant. So you would bring those animals in last. And then in doing that, make sure you're able to segregate them and direct it into a different program.
How do we get consumers more engaged and informed about antibiotic stewardship, especially in agriculture?
I think I touched on this a little bit earlier, but really it comes down to education and continual explanation as things are so confusing. Some really great resources that people can look to. We have a chain reaction report that we do every year with our coalition members for antibiotics off the menu. And we research and document all of the major fast food and fast casual companies and take a look at their antibiotics policies. So folks can check that out if they want to learn more about what fast food and fast casual companies adhere to responsible use of antibiotics policies. And then also just figuring out those labels. It really comes down to being educated on what you're buying, because we go to the supermarket once a week, once a month, and we're constantly supporting these companies and showing them that we approve of their standards by consuming and buying their products. So really educating yourself about what these labels mean and where your food is coming from is so important. And then I think we can go past that and start looking into education and all sorts of ways, making sure that folks are responsible consumers at all levels. But yeah, I really think it comes down to being familiar and having conversations with your friends and family about what they're buying.
Yes, and I'd love to add on that, just having that conversation, and in the human health and in the animal health sector, really just bringing it into a very personal perspective, like it's like with climate change, when you're talking to other people, talking about why it matters to you, what it really means, and sort of on a more emotive level, rather than just talking about the big figures that are out there in terms of the huge number of people that are going to die or the huge economic impact. It's making it more relatable as well as understanding and educating, because then when it becomes more real to people, I think that's really important.
I have another question related to labeling. I'm concerned about the One Health certified label that is not affiliated with the Global One Health Collaborative, another area of potential consumer confusion. Consumer Reports did a review of this issue in July of 2020. Can anyone on the panel speak to this, please? Is anyone familiar with that?
Unfortunately, I'm not familiar with it.
Okay, we'll move on to another question. So perhaps Dr. Patel can answer this one. Do studies confirm that MRSA is tied to antibiotics in agriculture?
Sorry, just trying to unmute myself. That's a good question. MRSA it's not the first bug that I think about when I'm thinking about agriculture, but the bacteria don't discriminate. So any bacteria really could be tied to getting antibiotics from, like something that you're eating. Really, MRSA, the way that you get something like MRSA is just overuse. In the last 100 years, it's become a bigger, badder bug because we overused penicillin and other antibiotics for so long for things like the common cold. And you guys have probably heard this, but if there is like one thing to take away that I hope you can leave with today, it's that, you probably don't need antibiotics every time you have a cold. More than 90% of the common cold is a virus. And we said earlier that antibiotics don't work against viruses. So, if we had known that, and if we hadn't taken all these antibiotics for many years, we may not even have MRSA around. So that's kind of the one thing that I would say is, everything is interrelated, and we're just trying to step back and make sure that we're using antibiotics for the things that we really need them for now.
And I would quickly add that there is a specific strain of MRSA, which is a livestock-associated methicillin-resistant MRSA, which is particularly an issue for people who are in direct contact with livestock operations, like swine operations in particular. So there is a particular strain which is directly connected to livestock, yes.
So the next question has been directed to Chris, but of course anyone is welcome to respond as well. So this question asks, what are the major impediments for beef and pork producers who primarily use a confinement approach to transition to using fewer medically important antibiotics? And the second part of the question is whether you have any opinion on the US Roundtable on Sustainable Beef.
Okay. The second part, I'm not in a position to answer, but I think in terms of what's driving the challenges with pork and beef, first off, I mean, the animals just, they live longer than chickens, right? And there's, their feed conversion is not as efficient. So you have a lot more costs tied up, in those animals. I think the other piece too is, I mean, it is a system. A lot of infrastructure has been designed around this model, and the investment levels are very significant. And the cost, I mean, it's a system that's built on, really taking every bit of cost possible out of the system. And it's a big leap for companies to they have to ask the question, if I move away from that model, if I add cost, will that put me at a disadvantage, versus my competitors? And I think that's something that weighs heavily on a lot of companies in making that choice. So again, I think that's where, the fact that we've seen such a big decline recently in no antibiotics ever pork, speaks to the fact that if, that the risk seems higher to your larger companies. And so the most important thing we can do is help regain traction, regain the momentum, because it was there a few years ago. I think consumers are paying more attention today, but I think, I think if there's one takeaway for everybody, it's, this is not there's no silver bullet here to fix this. It's going to have to be a combination of, policy work, a combination of collaboration with advocacy groups and food suppliers. We all want it to move faster. I think Payal's points, are really important. We have to move faster, but it's going to take a coordinated effort, I think, to really drive this at the pace that we need to moving forward.
Anyone else want to jump in there or answer the second part of the question in regards to the U.S. Roundtable on Sustainable Beef? No? Okay, I have another question in regards to the beef sector. We have seen a lot of finger pointing in the beef sector. Retailers want the processors to act first. Processors want the producers to change. Producers want demand to change. How do we get around this? Which domino needs to fall first? I can tell you all want to answer this question, but Kezia, go for it.
Thank you. I was going to say that I think it's a great question and it's a real challenge. I think continuing consumer and investor pressure is a key part of that, but I also think it's really important to try and move away from this kind of adversarial dialogue and this kind of finger pointing. Not saying that I have the answer for how to facilitate that, but as much as possible, pointing to examples where there is successful reductions as well is really important, and getting champions who are the producers, who are the retailers who are taking those steps. So they're talking from peer to peer rather than just having adversarial kind of conversations between different stakeholders.
Yeah, I was going to echo the same point. It's the $1 million question. And I think as folks that are working on this issue, especially from the consumer interest and advocacy standpoint, it is one of our biggest considerations when we're talking about moving the needle on this issue. And the more I've seen, the more we need to encourage open and consistent dialogue between all three of these sectors as much as possible, and show that we're not out to get any one company. We are here to protect public health, and we as a community can make that change, and we know it's possible, and we've seen it with responsible producers. So yeah, it's going to be a consistent conversation, and hopefully we can keep the dialogue moving in a more and more civil direction, and get as many folks on board as possible into the conversation. People whose voices haven't been heard, people who feel like their viewpoints aren't taken seriously. Anything we can do to keep moving forward with this issue and get as much support on board as possible. But I don't have one clear issue. There is no one domino that can fall unless anyone else has a silver bullet up their sleeve.
And I just add as well, I think with the investor pressure that will continue to happen and engagements as much as possible with companies across the supply chain, I think it works in tandem with the consumer pressure piece of pointing towards not just the ethical imperative of acting on antimicrobial resistance, but also that it makes increasingly business sense to make that transition as well.
Yeah, I just want to comment real quick. My experience has not been one that's adversarial. You know, I think, you know, I've seen, you know, a lot of partners, whether food service or retail, who are willing to go down this path. They're willing to test it and they're willing to try it. And, you know, the key is coming back to, you know, when that test takes place, it has to get traction. Some of that's incumbent on us, you know, as the supplier to generate pull, but also on consumers to, you know, to pay attention and, you know, collectively work to get the message out. But I don't think it's as adversarial today as it was a few years ago.
So I think we have time for one more audience question before I ask a wrap-up question of each of you. Let's see if we can get through this one quickly. There was a survey of veterinarians and producers published last year where many said there were times where a raised without antibiotics label takes precedence over animal health and welfare. How do we ensure measures or labels to reduce antibiotic use don't harm the animal itself?
I think there might be a piece around education. I think Chris illustrated this really nicely when he talked about the fact that animals are treated if they do need to be treated. They're just taken out of the supply chain that goes into the no antibiotics ever label branded products. So the idea that vets, of course, continue to have the role to play of actually diagnosing and prescribing diagnosing clinical infection, prescribing antibiotics where an animal is sick. And I think the consensus across industry, across the food system, is that of course, we don't want to move to a place where animals aren't being treated if they are ill. So maybe there's a piece about education there, as well as a piece about, I think raising awareness is really important.
Yeah, and I think just to build on that, pay attention to the accompanying claims, right? So, you know, make sure, you know, hold them accountable, make sure there's more than just a no antibiotics ever claim. And the one that's there, you know, dig into it, make sure it's meaningful. And then, you know, I think lastly, you know, a lot of companies, Nyman's a great example, Purdue's a good example, you know, have documented support from a number of advocacy groups. You know, so I think if it's an important issue to you, you can dig into it, and companies that are really, I think, making progress on both fronts, you know, will have the support of multiple groups.
Yes, that transparency is so important, I think, for investors, for everybody to be able to see the data, see the disclosures from companies about the policies and what they mean by the terms they're using. Absolutely.
So we've talked a lot about the different roles and responsibilities each sector has, but in just a couple of seconds, I would love to hear from each of you advice and recommendations that you could give to each person in our audience. What can each of us do to help combat antibiotic resistance? Dr. Patel, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I think that I hopefully made this point, but I would say for everyone listening to this, remember that, you know, almost every single cold is caused by a virus. And so it's not helpful to take the antibiotics that you have in your closet that you saved from the last time, or to call your doctor for antibiotics. That cold, what I tell patients is either I give you antibiotics and then you'll have a cold and diarrhea that was caused by the antibiotics, or I don't give you antibiotics and then you just have the cold. You pick. And so just remember that the next time, and that actually could help you in the future when you do need antibiotics for a serious bacterial infection.
Andrew.
I would go back to the consumer angle, and I basically just spend the extra 50 cents or $1 or whatever it is when you're buying products, you know, that say no antibiotics ever, because I think that ultimately is what's going to get a producer's attention.
Kezia.
Yes, I think voting with your wallet where you can. I think actually raising with your retailer, raising with even with the food companies to actually engage them on social media or through consumer awareness organizations that it's an issue that you care about. And even where it's possible with your pension provider, something like that, with the people who are investing on your behalf, to actually say, hey, what are they doing about this as well? Asking investors how they're incorporating this as a risk into their engagement in their investments.
Sydney.
Yeah, I'm gonna plug public policy. Get in contact with your legislators, whether it's at the federal level or the state level. There are great bills that are coming up across the country that people can be supporting, but legislators need to hear that you care about this issue. So get in contact with your local offices, call for movement forward on this issue, and hopefully we will see some big changes soon.
Chris, you get the last word.
Okay, I'll be brief, but building on vote with your wallets, a lot of the movement within the food industry has been driven by restaurants. I think they play a unique role. They're part of the social fabric of each and every community, and they are very much struggling right now. So I think doing what we can to support them. I also think getting really specific from a policy standpoint, supporting the Restaurants Act, reaching out to your senators, because they've played an invaluable role in getting us to this point. And, I think to continue the conversation, continue to make progress, we're going to need their support moving forward.
All right, we're out of time, unfortunately, but my sincere thanks to all of our outstanding panelists. It was an excellent conversation, and thanks to everyone in the audience for joining us. Have a good night. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Happy Antibiotic Awareness Week, y'all.